Okay, so this chapter deals with aging and services for older adults. So looking at aging in the United States, particularly at changing demographics, so we see that baby boomers, so these are individuals who were born after the period following the end of World War II, so about 1946, for about the next 10 to 15 years. These individuals are aging, right? And so they are gradually phasing themselves out of the employment sector. Additionally, we can look at the increase in life expectancy. So now individuals are expected to live longer than ever before. In addition, we can look at the fact that there are about 40 million people over the age of 65 living in the United States. So 65 is traditionally seen as the cutoff point for entering into the stage of life defined as old age. It's also traditionally the age of retirement, but we'll talk about that a little bit more and some of the factors that are coming into play here. Looking at aging populations, looking at this worldwide, this is creating a global financial crisis in the sense that the number of people who are growing older, the number of people who basically our social programs will need to support. So if we look at our social programs in the United States that are directed at older individuals, Social Security, that's one of the primary ones, and then Medicare as well, right? So providing health care for individuals who are not working. So Social Security in particular relies on a number of individuals in the workforce. So this relies on younger people to be working to pay in to support older people who are retired. So we're going to see some serious problems. So if you guys follow the news, you see that the Social Security crisis is something that is imminent, something that is discussed often, because as more and more individuals continue to retire, there are not enough young people who are replacing them in the workforce. So it's basically creating this imbalance where we have lots and lots of people retiring, but not enough people at the bottom to be able to support the people who are retiring. You can think of it as an inverted pyramid. Too many people at the top, not enough people at the bottom in the workforce to support. This is a serious problem in places like Italy and also in places like Japan. This could potentially become a problem in China as well, where the birth rate, so that's the number of infants who are born each year, is not sufficient to be able to support the economy because we have so many older adults who are living longer and who are going to be in need of support later on into their adult years. So definitely affects you, even though you guys are young and not really aging yet. Nonetheless, these things have implications for your lives. Okay, so looking at this from a developmental perspective, so we can talk about the old, so individuals who are roughly between ages 65 to about 80, and then the old. So these are individuals who are over the age of 80. And as I said in the previous slide, this is going to start becoming more and more common as individuals continue to have their life expectancies grow. There are cultural expectations that come along with understanding aging from a developmental perspective. So things like marriage, child rearing, employment, and home ownership all have an impact on those who are in the early stages of adulthood. But these also likely have an impact on individuals who are continuing to grow into older age, and we'll talk about some of those implications here. Just in the same way that for the old, there are things like developmental transitions that they're going through, like retirement. We can also look at increase in physical problems, so health problems, and widowhood, so loss of your spouse, loss of your domestic partner. And these can all have an impact on individuals later in life. if we try to apply developmental theory to understanding this transition into old age, we can look at Erik Erikson's theory. And remember, with Erikson's theory, he looks at 8 transitions that occur over the course of the lifespan. And the final stage that individuals go through is what he called ego integrity versus ego despair. So in Erikson's final stage here, he believed that individuals are looking back. So late in life, they are looking back over the course of their entire life. And if they can look back and be relatively happy, relatively satisfied with the progress that they've made in their lives, with the course that their life has taken, they will likely end their life more on the end of this ego integrity end of the continuum. If, however, the individuals look back on life and they're very dissatisfied, they're very upset, they might be very bitter about choices that were made, they might have a lot of regrets as they look back, just be very unsatisfied on the whole with their entire lives, they will likely end up more with this ego despair. So that can be this kind of bitterness and dissatisfaction in old age. Okay, so let's talk about something called successful aging. So successful aging, this is a relatively new concept, and successful aging basically looks at how individuals can enjoy their later in life years. So how can individuals basically function at an optimal level later on in life? And sometimes this is seen as counter to the normal process of aging, which seems to discourage these high levels of activity in virtually all domains. So again, with the aging process, we start to see the deterioration of some kinds of physical capabilities, sometimes cognitive capabilities decline here as well, and that can impact how active an individual can be. But with the successful aging theory, sometimes also called an activity theory of aging, the more active a person is, the more successful their transition into old age will be, the more satisfied they will be. Okay, so looking at current issues that are impacting older adults and how these particular issues might influence you as a human service worker. So looking at something called ageism. So with ageism, this is discrimination that is based on the age of an individual. Okay, so discrimination based on a person's age. And these beliefs, these myths, that perpetuate about, what happens in old age are rampant in our society. In the United States in particular, we place a very, very high premium on youth and on being youthful, right? And no one wants to grow old. I mean, all you have to do is open a magazine and look at all of the advertisements, for things like Juvederm and Botox, right? To fill in those unsightly wrinkles on your face. So there is a strong emphasis on remaining youthful. And part of that emphasis is perpetuated by these myths that exist describing old age, that cognitive decline is inevitable, that old age is an awful, terrible thing, and these things simply are not true. And we'll talk about some of those myths in greater detail in just a minute here. Looking at housing options for older adults. So as a human service worker, you might find yourself coming into contact with some of these various housing options. So looking at retirement communities as a potential option for older adults, but also looking into government subsidized housing for older adults too. So especially after adults retire, sometimes, they lose that mainstream of income. And if they're relying primarily on something like Social Security, that does not really pay that much money. It's going to be very, very difficult for older adults to subsist, and so they might have to look to government subsidized housing for help. Additionally, looking at homelessness in older adults. Homelessness is a big problem in the older adult community, and something that definitely would require your attention as a human services worker. Particularly if we look at things like poverty in older adulthood. As I said, if you're relying primarily on Social Security for your day-to-day, and you don't have retirement savings, and you don't have another way to supplement your income, it can be very easy to lose your home and essentially become homeless. Okay, so looking at the process of retiring. So retiring, this is leaving the workforce. Retirement, one of the transitions in older adulthood. So there are several stages that are outlined in how an individual adjusts to this new role of retirement. So first stage, the remote possibility of retiring, right? So there's some anticipation that in the future you might retire, but there's little planning that's involved. In stage 2, though, you start to prepare, right? You start to prepare actively for your retirement. So this could include things like getting your finances in order, figuring out, where you're going to live, and fantasizing about how great it would be to not have a job. After retirement, this honeymooning stage, this state of euphoria, this stage where you're so excited that you don't have a job anymore, that you have to go to, 5 days a week, and you don't have a boss anymore telling you what to do. So you're really, really enjoying it. But then we move into stage 4, the stage of disenchantment. So, imagine you've been working your whole life, and suddenly you don't have that job anymore. A lot of people really form their sense of identity based on what they do. I mean, that's one of the first questions, right, that people ask you when they meet you. What do you do? What do you do for a living? And so imagine, after you retire, all of these kinds of mixed emotions that you have. You're excited that you don't have to go there, to your job anymore and do X, Y, and Z. But at the same time, you've just been stripped of that sense of purpose, that sense of meaning, that sense of identity. And you might experience some pretty severe boredom, right? Possibly depression as well. So in stage 5, then, you're reorienting yourself. So you're becoming a little bit more realistic about what it's going to be like to not have that career anymore. And you start to explore other ways to find meaning in your life. Moving into stage 6 with stability, you start to pursue activities that become more important, right, in your daily life, part of your routine, part of what you use to define yourself in the same way that your job used to define yourself. So, for example, you might join some kind of service organization. You might start taking group fitness classes at the gym or something like that. After my father retired, he I think he didn't have a job for about a month. He's a pretty active kind of guy. And at the end of that month, my mom told him he had to find a job because he was driving her crazy. But in addition to that, he started managing a food pantry in the local area, so doing that as a volunteer job. And then he also got a part-time job working at the local hospital. So, although he got to transition from his career, which had been a very, very stressful position, he ultimately went into this fermentation stage where he returned to work later on in life because he needed something, to keep him going, to give him that sense of identity. Okay, so other things that you need to be aware of as a human service worker. If you're working with older adults, you need to understand that some older adults might actually be parenting their grandchildren. And this is something that is very common, particularly within ethnic minority communities. So you can probably see then how this can be a very stressful thing for older adults to be doing, especially if they're parenting very young children, right? We can look at issues of depression. So depression can be caused by multiple different things in older adulthood, but particularly related to loss of roles. So things like, loss of your career, perhaps loss of your spouse, loss of your domestic partner, maybe loss of your friends, right? As, people get older and perhaps start to die. Additionally, we can look at the development of dementia. So dementia, this is cognitive decline. So Alzheimer's disease, good example of dementia. And many adults will experience this, but growing old does not necessarily mean that you will experience dementia. Oftentimes some of the stereotypes that we have about older adults is that they're not cognitively with it, they're kind of in this like fog, they're not all together, and oftentimes that perceived fog is caused by combinations of medications that older adults are on, and it's not actually related to cognitive problems. So as individuals grow older, their processing speed, so how quickly they can take pieces of information, especially new pieces of information, understand it and apply it to solving problems, that processing speed tends to decline. But another kind of intelligence that's called crystallized intelligence, so this is information that information largely related to things that you have learned, particularly through schooling. That kind of intelligence, that crystallized intelligence, stays steady throughout the lifespan. So if you're an expert in your field at age 60, you can expect to still be an expert in your field later on in life as well. Looking at other human service potential roles here, you might be involved in investigating things like elder abuse. So this is basically abuse of older individuals. Older individuals are defined as a vulnerable population here, right? Especially if they cannot physically care for themselves. And instances of elder abuse tends to be very, very much underreported. So in looking at practice settings that serve older adults, there are many various settings that you could work in here, and I will absolutely encourage you, if you see yourself going into the human services field, there are so many opportunities to work in geriatrics, to work with older adult populations, and these opportunities will only increase, okay? So if you want job security, working with older populations is where it's at. You can work in various settings like adult daycares, geriatric assessment units, nursing homes. You can work with veterans, elder abuse programs, adult protective services, hospice as well, bereavement services, senior centers. So many, many different settings that you could potentially be working in. Looking at long-term health care, focusing on vulnerable populations in particular as they age. So looking at the particular issues that face women, that face ethnic minorities, and older adults who are living in rural or isolated communities. I mean, you guys can look at Elkins as a good example of this, that for older adults, particularly if they have a lot of health care problems, how realistic is it to expect that these individuals are going to be able to drive, a couple of hours to go see some kind of specialist for a health problem? You can obviously see how that is going to make getting the proper health care treatment very, very difficult for older individuals. Additionally, we can look at stress and racism and how those particular things are related to each other and how those affect their quality of life. So looking at ethnic minority populations who oftentimes experience these disparities in access to things like healthcare, in access to other resources in the surrounding community, and how those can ultimately impact their quality of life in a negative way. So older adults then, the population of older adults is definitely increasing in the United States. So again, if you want job security, work with older adults. Looking forward into the future, we need to focus as a human services field on continuing efforts to identify these vulnerable populations. We also need to address the shortage of affordable housing for older individuals, the kinds of long-term healthcare services that are directed at older adults, so increasing the quality of these and also increasing the availability, and then also looking at this increased role of parenting responsibilities that's placed on older adult populations. So trying to understand how that can disrupt this developmental transition for older adults and the particular challenges that grandparents who are parenting young children face.